Montpelier, Vermont, December 21st, 1887. Residents of the capital city of Vermont wake up and go about their normal everyday routines, and one of those being grabbing the morning's paper and taking a read through it. Throughout it, there would be no shocker to have regular old stories dotting the pages. However, on this winter's night in 1887, one story would stand out amongst the rest. At first, the story didn't gain much traction, however, later publications of this insane story would quickly grasp the attention of Vermont residents. Its author unknown to those who read it, and from 1887 to 1949, the contents of the story and the claims of its authenticity were shrouded in mystery. The story in question is one that follows an unnamed man venturing into a village in the middle of northern Vermont and discovering a disturbing sight. The residents of this small village participated in taking their elderly family members and freezing them, burying them alive, only for them to return from their frozen graves come the springtime. In a story that sounds straight from the annals of an Edgar Allan Poe masterpiece, today we dive into one of the most bizarre stories and legends that I have ever heard. Today, on Unblurring the Unknown, the Frozen Hill People. Welcome back to Unblurring the Unknown, as always. I am your host, Dominic, and today's episode is a little bit of a wild one, and a little far-fetched. So I hope for everyone's sake, you can follow along with me, because it is a very, very interesting and strange story that I feel like needs to be shared more. I obviously gave you a lot of background knowledge on today's topic in the intro, but before we dive into the story, let me give you a little more background. This story at its core is some type of urban legend, but where it stands out is the themes of rebirth and suspended animation. Now, this story, which was originally titled A Strange Tale, detailed an unnamed man traveling deep into the northern Vermont wilderness and finding a small village that participated in an unusual practice with their elderly family members. Due to the harsh winter weather the area would have, and the fact that the elderly weren't valuable members of the family units during winter, when food and supplies were scarce, these families would go through a practice of almost hibernating them, only for the elderly to come back alive and be unfrozen in the springtime, just in time to plant the season's crops. Sounds freaky? Sounds interesting? And if you're hooked, let me break you down on everything from start to finish. Now, before we dive into the story, I think it is important, however, to go over suspended animation and what it is, and its place in society today, as arguably that is what occurs here in the story of the Frozen Hill People. Now, suspended animation in theory is the idea that biological functions would stop so that physical ones could continue afterwards. We often see this with plants that have a type of dormant phase, or with animals that hibernate during winter months. Now, what is commonly believed for humans to undergo some type of suspended animation would be to freeze the human body almost close to the point of death, however, stopping before the person would normally die, and then reviving that person afterwards as long as there were kind of the correct situations in place so that the human brain was kind of still being supplied oxygen even though it was in this state. Now, in 2019, the first successful case of suspended animation on a human was conducted. The details of the operation remain not fully disclosed to the public yet because of patient confidentiality. Now, this technique of suspended animation has a term in the medical world, being called emergency preservation and resuscitation, or EPR, where a patient would arrive with extremely high blood loss due to some type of massive trauma, like a gunshot or a stab wound, and would likely only have a 5% chance or so to live under regular normal circumstances. EPR involves dramatically lowering the human body temperature by almost 10 to 15 degrees Celsius, or roughly 50 degrees Fahrenheit, by replacing the blood in the human body that was lost with ice-cold saline. This would drop the body temperature and almost make brain function non-existent. However, this gives doctors a chance to operate on the critical wounds sustained by the patient in question. The doctors would then have roughly 2 hours to complete the necessary actions to try and save the patient. Now, of course, EPR is not a guarantee, but it has made significant strides medically in recent years. These types of suspended animation experiments have also been conducted on animals, with also very overwhelmingly positive success. In 2005, at the University of Pittsburgh, they had managed to place dogs in a state of suspended animation by replacing the dog's blood with this ice-cold saline solution, then leaving them in this state for a few hours, and them being quote-unquote clinically dead. They would then replace this ice-cold saline solution back with the dog's blood, and with a good old electric shock, they were able to resuscitate the dogs almost like nothing had happened. The dogs' hearts started pumping the blood in their bodies again, and they were almost as good as new. Also, in 2006, at Mass General Hospital in Boston, doctors did a similar experiment on pigs, except this time they put the pigs under anesthesia, and to simulate major blood loss, they produced injuries on the pigs, by using a scalpel. Now, once the pigs had lost roughly half of their total blood, the doctors at Mass General replaced their blood with a chilled saline solution, and as the pig's internal body temperature reached approximately 50 degrees Fahrenheit, the doctors then went back and fixed the injuries and blood cell damage and returned the blood back to the pig's body and then attempted resuscitation. This experiment, although kind of morbid in practice, was tested 200 times with a 90% success rate, which, even though this is with pigs and not humans, it is extremely encouraging the idea of possibly using suspended animation to save lives from catastrophic blood loss caused by various types of injuries. Now, we have also seen isolated cases of humans entering some type of suspended animation without medical interference, like in the case of a 14-year-old boy from Missouri named John Smith, who fell through a frozen lake, remained trapped under the ice in this frozen lake, and then when rescued 15 minutes later, he had no pulse due to the coldness of the water, and his body temperature had dropped significantly. Now, because of this, because of the coldness of the water, and because of his body temperature dropping so dramatically, and even though he was submerged 15 minutes, when they got John Smith out of the water, he was still able to be resuscitated because the coldness had preserved his brain and heart function, even though his physical limitations were almost frozen in place, for lack of a better word. Now, there's a couple more cases of these that I'm going to share with you. Now, the second one being Paulie Hynek, who was just 2 years old at the time this incident would occur. He would suffer from a hypothermia-induced cardiac arrest when he wandered out of his home in Wisconsin and fell into a snowbank. Now, Paulie was clinically dead at the time medical professionals arrived, and when brought to the hospital, he was able to be resuscitated. Now, Paulie's body temperature dropped all the way down to a staggering 64 degrees Fahrenheit. Again, there's kind of a common theme here. The dramatic lowering of the body's temperature is somehow allowing the body to preserve its biological functions to keep living. Even though they're technically clinically dead, it's almost like the second they are warmed back up and then resuscitated, they're back to life. It's a kind of strange and freaky concept, to be honest. Now, and take maybe the strangest of these last three isolated instances of kind of suspended animation without medical interference, and that being the case of a Japanese man named Mitsutaka, Uchikoshi, and I believe I pronounced that right. If I did not, I do apologize. Now, Uchikoshi, who somehow, in some way, that even science can't fully explain, survived 24 days without food or water in some type of hibernation-like state in October of 2006. Uchikoshi got separated from his friends while hiking on Japan's Mount Roko. It is believed that he tripped and lost consciousness and was then found 24 days later. His doctor, Dr. Shinichi Sato, said that his body must have fell into some type of hypothermic state, and that his brain functions remained intact. When arriving at the hospital, Uchikoshi was treated for severe hypothermia, blood loss, and organ failure. Now, it is hotly debated how Uchikoshi, if this story is even real, survived that long without fluids, and this story in general is very hotly debated. However, it is another testimony of the human body being able to go under extreme feats of recovery once being subjected to the right conditions to being almost temporarily frozen. Now, Now that we have established kind of this big theme of today's episode with suspended animation and kind of this partial freezing of the human body and then being miraculously brought back to life, it ties in with today's story in the Frozen Hill People. And I wanted to provide all of that context and some very good backstory as to what's going to take place within this story. Now, let's talk about the contents of this story. And once we discuss that story, let's dive into its origins and how the story came to appear in the paper that winter's morning in 1887. Now, on December 21st, 1887, residents of the town of Montpelier, Vermont, woke up to a rather strange story published in their local paper, the Argus and Patriot, which is now known as the Times-Argus currently. The story was simply titled A Strange Tale, with the author being listed as A.M., just the initials A.M., no other name attached to it, just A.M. At the time of the story's original publishing, no one knew who A.M. was, although it wasn't uncommon for people to have their suspicions about who this mystery author could be. Now, the story is rumored to have taken place in the town of Calais, Vermont, although that is never actually stated by the author. Sleuths have merely determined the area he is referring to based off of where he gives for his location in the story. Calais is a very small village of roughly 1,600 people as of the 2020 census. It is about as quaint and stereotypical Vermont that you might think of, like the cute TikTok videos from the Crazy Fall Tourists. Now, the story of the Frozen Hill People, in this story titled A Strange Tale, is quite long in its entirety, but like I said, I will share it all for you folks listening. Now, I'm going to start the story. Again, like I mentioned, it is quite long. For that, I do apologize, but I think it's important I share the entire thing. Now, let's start the story, and I quote, "I am an old man now, and have seen some strange sights in the course of a roving life in foreign lands, as well as in this country. But none so strange as one I found in an old diary kept by my Uncle William that came into my possession a few years ago at his decease. The events described took place in a mountain town some 20 miles from Montpelier, the capital of Vermont. I have been to the place on the mountain and seen the old log house where the events I found recorded in the diary took place, and seen and talked with an old man who vouched for the truth of the story and that his father was one of the parties operated on. The account runs this wise. January 7th. I went on the mountain today and witnessed what to me was a horrible sight. It seems that the dwellers there, who were unable either from age or other reasons to contribute to the support of their families, are disposed of in the winter in a manner that would shock the ones who reads this diary unless that person lives in the vicinity. I will describe what I saw. 6 persons, 4 men and 2 women. The man a cripple, about 30 years old. The other 5, past the age of usefulness, lay on the earthy floor of the cabin, drugged into insensibility, while the members of the families were gathered about them in apparent indifference. In a short time, the unconscious bodies were inspected by several old people, who said, 'They are ready.' They were then stripped of all their clothing, except for a single garment. Then the bodies were carried outside and laid on logs, exposed to the bitter cold mountain air, the operation having been delayed several days for suitable weather. It was night when the bodies were carried out, and the full moon, occasionally obscured by flying clouds, shone on their upturned, ghastly faces, and a horrible fascination kept me by the bodies as long as I could endure the severe cold. Soon I could stand the cold no longer, and went inside, where I found the friends in cheerful conversation. In about an hour, I went out and looked at the bodies. They were fast freezing. Again, I went inside where the men were smoking their clay pipes, but silence had fallen on them. Perhaps they were thinking of the time when their time would come to be carried out, for in the same way. One by one, they lay down on the floor and went to sleep. I could not shut out the sight of their freezing bodies outside. Neither could I bear to be in darkness, but I piled on the wood in the cavernous fireplace and seated on a shingle block passed the dreary night. January 8th. Day came at length, but did not dissipate the terror that filled me. The frozen bodies became visible white on the snow that lay in huge drifts about them. The women gathered about the fire and soon commenced preparing breakfast. The men awoke and conversation began commencing. Affairs assumed a more cheerful aspect. After breakfast, the men lighted their pipes, and some of them took a yoke of oxen and went off towards the forest, while others proceeded to nail together boards, making a box about 10 feet long and half as high and wide. When this was completed, they placed about 2 feet of straw in the bottom. Then they laid 3 frozen bodies in the straw. Then the faces and upper part of the bodies were covered with a cloth. The more straw was put in the box, and the other 3 bodies placed on top and covered the same as the first ones, with cloth and straw. Boards were then firmly nailed on top to protect the bodies from being injured by carnivorous animals that made their home on these mountains. By this time, the men who went off with the ox team returned with a huge load of spruce and hemlock boughs, which they unloaded at the foot of a steep ledge, came to the house and loaded the box containing the bodies on the sled and drew it to the foot of the ledge near the load of the boughs. These were soon piled on and around the box, and it was left to be covered with snow, which I was told would lay in drifts 20 feet deep over this rude tomb. "We shall want our men to plant our corn next spring," said a youngish-looking woman, the wife of one of the frozen men. "And if you want to see them resuscitated, you come here about the 10th of next May." With this agreement, I left the mountaineers, living and frozen to their fate, and returned to my home in Boston, where it was weeks before I was fairly myself, as my thoughts would return to that mountain with its awful sepulchre. Turning the leaves of the diary, the old man recounts he came to the following entry. May 10th. I arrived here at 10 a.m., after riding about 4 hours over muddy, unsettled roads. The weather here is warm and pleasant. Most of the snow is gone except here and there are drifts in the fence corners and hollows, but nature is not yet dressed in green. I found the same parties here I left last January, ready to disinter the bodies of their friends. I had no expectation of finding any life there, but a feeling that I could not resist impelled me to come and see. We repaired at once the well-remembered spot on the ledge. The snow had melted from the top of the brush, but still lay deep around the bottom of the pile. The men commenced work at once, some shoveling and others tearing away the brush. Soon the box was visible. The cover was taken off, the layers of straw removed, and the bodies, frozen and apparently lifeless, lifted out and laid on the snow. Large troughs made out of hemlock logs were placed nearby, filled with tepid water, into which the bodies were placed separately, with the head slightly raised. Boiling water was then poured into the trough from kettles hung on poles nearby, until the water was as hot as I could hold my hand in. Hemlock boughs had been put in the boiling water in such quantities that they had given the water the color of wine. After lying in the bath about an hour, color began to return to the bodies, when all hands began rubbing and chafing them. This continued about an hour, when a slight twitching of the muscles of the face and limbs, followed by audible gasps, showed that life was not quenched, and that vitality was returning. Spirits were given in small quantities, and allowed to trickle down their throats. Soon they could swallow, and more was given to them when their eyes opened and they began to talk, and finally sat up in their bathtubs. They were taken out and assisted to the house, where after a hearty meal they seemed as well as ever, and in no wise injured, but rather refreshed by their long sleep of 4 months. Truly, truth is stranger than fiction. Now, that was the entirety of A Strange Tale that was originally published in December 21st of 1887. Now, this story from start to finish is a very hard one to believe, and at first the residents of Montpelier who read this story didn't think much of it. Of course, they thought it was very strange and peculiar, but they didn't think much past that. They, of course, theorized about who this mysterious author could have been, but other than that, that was pretty much it, and the story was lost to time for a little bit. That was until 1938. Albert Stevens, a resident of Bridgewater Corners, Vermont, would have a piece of the story buried in his personal belongings. It would be in a scrapbook, owned by his passed-away mother of his, and in this scrapbook the story would be described. It was yellow and faded, and it was an old newspaper clipping about the story, but it was there. And at this point, it was 50 years old, and many people had forgotten about the story entirely. Now, Albert Stevens was tracked down by Bob Tuckman, a reporter from the Rutland Herald. Tuckman knew the story was begging to be retold, and that's exactly what he did. Tuckman would take the story he got from Albert Stevens and featured A Strange Tale in Yankee magazine in 1941, and then would retell it again 2 years later in 1943 in the Old Farmer's Almanac. The story was also picked up by author Charles Crane, who wrote about this entire tale in his book Winter in Vermont, and would sometimes read this story over the radio in certain parts of the state. Now, when the story got picked up by Bob Tuckman and kind of got retold a few times here from 1941 to 1943, this is when it really started to take off, and people were more curious as to whether or not this crazy story was real and who the author was. The buzz was legit, and it was a lot more widespread than the initial publishing back in 1887. Now, this caused some people to start digging even more into the story, and in 1949, author Roland Robbins decided he too wanted to research the story and the author responsible for it. He scoured Vermont State Archives and found an original copy of the story from the Argus and Patriot and published a story in Vermont Life that same year. His publishing of the story also had a similar effect. People wanted to find out more about the story and whether or not it was really genuine or not. It turns out that during the time from when Charles Crane published his book with the story back in it in 1941, people from neighboring states were sending flurries of mail to Montpelier, and the government officials that worked there, they were sending the mail regarding the veracity of the story. They wanted to know whether or not that this was real. Did this really happen? Are people being frozen alive in the mountains of northern Vermont and then being thawed back to life? Is that still happening? Did that happen? Is this story real? And everybody wanted to know because nobody had an answer to the question. Now, when Robbins published his article of the story in Vermont Life, and again, this is another instance of where the story gets retold again, this got the attention of a woman named Mabel Hines. Now, Mabel Hines got in touch with Robbins and claimed that her grandfather, Alan Morse, was the author of the original story and was the AM listed as the author for the story. Now, who was this Alan Morse? Alan was born in 1835 in Woodbury, Vermont, and by 1840 he had moved to the Calais area, the same place where our story supposedly takes place. Morse was a well-known storyteller to his family and the area. He fathered 4 children and was a dairy farmer by trade, and at one point in his life even served as a public notary. Alan also had in his possession the first pump organ in the area, so many people would travel to the Morse home in the evenings to listen to Alan's organ and participate in singing. Now, the Morse home was also a very popular spot to tell stories, one in which Mabel Hines recalls as A Strange Tale, that she had originally heard from her grandfather when she was 10 years old. Mabel said that this was her grandfather's favorite story to tell, and often would tell it at family gatherings and picnics. Now, it turns out, for a surprise for Alan's 52nd birthday, Mabel's mother, Alice, would surprise her father by sending in A Strange Tale to get published in the Argus and Patriot newspaper as a birthday gift. Now, even though the story of the Frozen Hill people of northern Vermont is nothing more than a fantastic piece of storytelling, it holds an interesting idea when looking at it through a modern-day lens. The idea of freezing your loved ones through cryotherapy and suspended animation surgical procedures are becoming more common nowadays, and the examples of these modern medical miracles, in the case of John Smith, Polly Heineck, and Mitsutaka Uchikochi, provide us with more questions about the human body and its abilities that might not be fully understood yet. Now, the story of the Frozen Hill people is one in which, even though it doesn't remain as a mystery, it still sticks out as a strong candidate for the powers of storytelling and how society and its people can be gripped by them. As someone like myself who loves history and, of course, storytelling, because if I didn't, why would I even have this podcast to begin with? I thoroughly enjoyed this one. And like I mentioned, even though there is no unsolved questions or enduring mysteries here, or even a whole theories section that you've come to expect out of me when I do my episodes, I hope that this episode was a fun one for you all who are tuning in and listening. And hope that this was a good change of pace here for an episode topic where the weather is starting to cool down now, and that, of course, winter will be here before we know it. Again, unfortunately, there is no more to this mystery. The questions have been answered. The mystery has been solved. We know who wrote this story, and that the story was arguably just that, just a story. Maybe not a hoax that you might traditionally think of as a hoax, because I don't think that anything involved in the story of the Frozen Hill people, or anything that took place in A Strange Tale, was meant to influence people in a way to feel tricked, to feel duped into thinking that these events actually happened. I don't think that there was anything malicious behind the story, or the idea that kind of sent people into a frenzy trying to figure out whether or not this story was real. Now again, obviously, like I mentioned, you've come to expect a theory section out of me. Again, no theories. I know that is unfortunate. I know I like discussing all of the crazy outlandish theories and then maybe some down-to-earth ones. I apologize, there's no theories section. But again, regardless, I hope you really enjoyed this week's episode and the change of pace that it brought. But with that being said, that is going to conclude this week's episode on the Frozen Hill people. If you have any feedback on this episode, again, this one might be a little bit out in left field in terms of topics I've done before, kind of more myth, kind of more urban legend. If you liked this change of pace and if you liked today's topic, please let me know in the comments section. You can send me an email, that is unblurringtheunknown@gmail.com. You can send that to me, send me your thoughts, send me your feedback. And while you're there, send me a topic suggestion. That is very much something that you can do. I tell people to do it. I beg for topic suggestions. They get thrown right into the queue and pushed up at the top of my priority list, and I try and get them out to you as soon as I possibly can. Again, send that to my email, unblurringtheunknown@gmail.com. You can also send that through Instagram direct message. I do check that as well, so you can send your topic suggestions there. If you're listening to this on YouTube, please like, comment, subscribe. It helps me out with the algorithm gods, and I greatly, greatly appreciate it. Now, if you're listening on Spotify, please turn on post notifications so you get notified every time I post a new episode. Again, this is the second episode I'm recording here in kind of my new, I'm calling it a pseudo studio because it's not really a studio. It's kind of a guest bedroom I have here in my new apartment. So pseudo studio is what I'm going to call it for now, because again, it's not really a studio, but the acoustics in this room are a lot better than what you might be used to hearing from me. So obviously, I'm not talking as loud to the microphone, and I hope that I'm coming in more clear. But if it kind of sounds a little bit like an echo chamber, that is, of course, why I'm in this new recording space. And steps in the right direction for me. Again, hope to keep climbing up the ladder in terms of the content that I provide for you all. But again, with that being said, that will conclude this week's episode on the Frozen Hill people of Northern Vermont. Very strange and wacky story for you all today, and I hope you all appreciated it. And on that note, I will see you all on the next one.